Don't touch anything in that office, the retired ambassador said to me at my grandfather's graveside. Go to Zurich first. Use his full name. They've been waiting. The wind off the Potomac cut sideways that morning, cold enough that I could feel it through my coat. There were maybe 6 people total at the burial, a pastor I'd never met, 2 men from the veterans post who'd driven 3 hours and said almost nothing, my cousin, and the ambassador, standing slightly apart from everyone else, watching the casket the way people watch something they've been expecting for a long time. My grandfather was buried in a small cemetery outside Fredericksburg, Virginia. Not Arlington? He had specifically requested otherwise. Said national cemeteries felt like real estate to him. He wanted grass and quiet and a stone that didn't have to compete with anyone else's. He got all 3. I was the one who arranged it. I was the one who had been calling every Sunday for the past 4 years, driving down from D.C., on long weekends bringing him groceries he didn't need and sitting with him through baseball games he'd seen a dozen times. My mother's father, Harold Weston, former Army Ranger, 81 years old. He lived in the same house in Spotsylvania County since 1987, and he drove the same Ford pickup until 6 months before he died. My uncle, my mother's brother, called me 3 hours after the burial. I assume you're handling the estate, he said. Not a question. His name is Marcus, and there was something in the way he said it, flat and quick, that I recognized immediately. It wasn't concern, it was positioning. I'm the executor, I said. Right. Dad never had much, so it shouldn't take long. I didn't respond to that. I told him I'd be in touch when I had more information, and I got off the phone. I had known Marcus my whole life. He lived outside Charlotte and came up for Christmas when it was convenient, which was most years, but not all of them. He had his own business, a home renovation company that had done well for a stretch and then hadn't. Grandpa had helped him twice that I knew of, once in 2016 when the business nearly closed, once in 2016 when he needed to refinance something I was never given the full details on. Grandpa never talked about it. Marcus never brought it up. After the burial, I drove to Grandpa's house alone. The ambassador had pressed the card into my hand while everyone else was focused on the casket being lowered. He'd said what he said quickly and quietly, and then he'd walked to his car without being introduced to anyone. The card had no title on it, just a name and a phone number with a country code I didn't immediately recognize. +41. I had to look it up when I got to the house. Switzerland. Grandpa's house smelled like wood smoke and old wool. He kept the thermostat low because he said heat made him lazy. His reading glasses were still on the kitchen counter beside a half-finished crossword. I sat down at the table where I had eaten probably 100 Sunday meals, and I looked at the card for a long time. My grandfather had served in Vietnam, 2 tours. He never described either one in detail, and I had learned young not to press. What I knew was mostly from things he let slip over the years, the heat, the weight of the equipment, the way sound traveled differently through jungle than through open air. He came home in 1971 and went to school on the GI Bill and eventually worked for the State Department for over 2 decades in logistics and contracts. He retired in 2002. After that, he came back to Virginia and lived the way he always had, quietly and without any visible interest in impressing anyone. He had no obvious wealth. The house was paid off. His truck was old. He kept a small savings account at a local credit union. When he filled out paperwork, he listed his occupation as retired government contractor and his assets as modest. But he had been to Switzerland. I found the evidence in the same place I always find things I wasn't supposed to find, which is the second shelf of the hall closet behind a stack of old National Geographics. A passport in a leather case, his name on the cover, the pages inside dense with stamps. Zurich, Basel, Geneva, Bern. Trips going back 17 years that I had never known about, sometimes twice in a single year. I sat on the edge of his bed and tried to match those stamps to the man I thought I knew. He had told me he didn't like to travel, said airports were organized misery. I had believed him. Marcus texted that night. Any update on the house and accounts? I told him I was still going through paperwork. He wrote back within 30 seconds. Let me know if you need help sorting. He had never once offered to help sort anything. I called the Swiss number the next morning. A man answered, not a woman, speaking careful and precise English. I gave him my grandfather's full name, Harold James Weston, and I waited. The pause was long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Yes, he said. We have been expecting to hear from you. Are you his granddaughter? Yes. We will need identification and a certified copy of the death certificate. When are you able to travel? I told him I would need 2 weeks to arrange things. He said that was completely fine. He gave me an address in Zurich and a reference number to bring with me and said someone would be available to meet with me at any hour I chose. He asked if I had any questions. I didn't know where to begin, so I said no. After I hung up, I walked through every room of the house. I was looking for, I didn't know what, something that would make the passport make sense, something that would explain why a man who clipped grocery coupons and kept a handwritten budget taped inside his kitchen cabinet had been traveling to Switzerland every year for 17 years. The file cabinet in the office was locked. I found the key in the ceramic bowl on his desk where he kept pens and rubber bands and small batteries. Inside were tax returns, property documents, a folder of medical records, everything ordinary, everything expected, except one folder near the back, sicker than the others, labeled only with a date, 2003. Inside were the originals of what appeared to be a trust agreement. Multiple pages, dense legal language, signed in his handwriting at the bottom of each one, witnessed and notarized. The name of a financial institution in Zurich. The year matched the last stamp in his old passport, a renewal he would have needed if he'd started making those trips around that time. I didn't fully understand the documents. I wasn't meant to yet. But I understood enough to know that whatever my grandfather had left behind, it was not nothing. I didn't tell Marcus about the folder. I didn't tell Marcus about Zurich. When he called 2 days before my flight, I told him I was meeting with the estate attorney in Fredericksburg to sort out the probate process. That was true. I just left out the rest. He drove up anyway. I found out when he sent a text saying he was 20 minutes out and asking if he could come by the house. I said yes, because what else do you say? He arrived and walked through the front door and stood in the living room the way someone stands in a space they're already measuring. He looked at the furniture. He looked at the shelves. He picked up a small carved wooden box that had sat on the side table for as long as I could remember and turned it over in his hands. What's this worth? He asked. It was his, I said. He set it down. I'm just trying to understand what we're dealing with. There's not much to deal with yet. The process takes time. He walked to the kitchen and leaned against the counter. He was always like this, he said. Kept everything close. You never knew where you stood with him. That wasn't how I had experienced Grandpa at all. But I understood that Marcus was saying something true about his own experience of their relationship, so I didn't argue it. He wasn't easy, I said. He had his favorites, Marcus said, looking at me directly. He loved you. He trusted you. He said it without anger, which somehow made it land harder. Different thing. I had nothing useful to say to that, so I made coffee and we sat at the kitchen table the way I'd sat with Grandpa 100 times, and I let Marcus talk. He talked about the business, about a contract that had fallen through the previous spring, about his youngest, who wanted to go to art school and how expensive that was going to be. He wasn't asking me for anything specifically. He was establishing context. When he left, he hugged me in the doorway and told me to keep him informed. His voice was warmer than it had been inside. I told him I would. That night I booked my flight. 1 bag. 3 days. I brought Grandpa's passport, my own passport, the trust folder, and a certified death certificate I'd ordered from the county. I didn't know what I was walking into, but something about the way the ambassador had spoken, unhurried, specific, like someone completing an errand they'd been carrying for years, told me this was not going to be surprising to the people waiting on the other end. Zurich in February is gray and cold and very still. The streets downtown are clean in a way that feels intentional. The lake is flat, and the buildings are old stone, and the whole place has a kind of deliberate quietness that reminded me immediately of Grandpa, which I had not expected. The address I'd been given was not a large bank. It was a private wealth management firm, 6 stories, understated signage, the kind of place that did not need to advertise. I gave the reference number at the reception desk. A woman offered me coffee. I accepted. A man named Werner met me in a small conference room on the 4th floor. He was in his 60s, gray suit, a firm handshake, and he expressed his condolences without making them feel like a formality. "Your grandfather spoke of you," he said. That stopped me. "What did he say?" "That you were steady." He smiled slightly. He used that word specifically, steady. He opened a folder and turned it so I could read along. My grandfather had established a revocable trust in 2003 that had become irrevocable upon his retirement from the State Department. The trust held investments, primarily index funds and conservative bonds, that had been managed by this firm for over 20 years. The contributions had been consistent throughout, a portion of his government pension, a portion of his contracting income in later years, directed automatically each month. The total current value of the trust was just over $9 million. I looked at the number for a long time without saying anything. Werner waited. "He drove a 2009 pickup truck," I finally said. "Yes," Werner said. He mentioned the truck. The trust had 3 categories of beneficiaries. The first was a list of individuals, former members of his Ranger Battalion and their immediate families, designated to receive specific payments for medical care, educational support, and housing assistance in cases of documented hardship. The second was a scholarship fund at Virginia Tech, where he had finished his degree after Vietnam, administered through the university's foundation. The third was what Werner called the Family Stabilization Provision, a capped annual allocation available to designated family members under specific conditions, requiring documented financial need and a structured repayment or accountability plan. I was named a successor trustee. Marcus was not named as a beneficiary. I read that part twice. Werner pointed to a sealed envelope at the corner of the table. "He asked that this be given to you in person," he said. "He was very specific about that." I picked it up. My name was written on the outside in Grandpa's handwriting, the same handwriting from the crossword puzzles, and the birthday cards and the grocery lists he used to give me when I asked if he needed anything. My phone buzzed. "Marcus, calling to check in. What's the update from the attorney?" I let it go to voicemail. I set the phone face down on the table and opened the envelope. The paper inside was thick. He had written on both sides. The handwriting was neat and unhurried, like everything else about him. "If you're reading this, then I wasn't able to sit down with you the way I planned. I kept meaning to. I kept thinking there was more time. There wasn't. I need you to understand that I didn't keep this from you out of doubt. I kept it from you because of what money does to conversations. It changes the air in the room. People start listening differently. I didn't want you to look at me differently. I wanted you to keep coming on Sundays." He wrote about the men he had served with, not all of them, but specific ones. A man named Clifton, who came home from Vietnam with damage to his hearing and his marriage and spent 20 years fighting the VA for benefits he was legally owed. A man named George, whose son had a seizure disorder and no insurance, and whose family had lost their house when he was 22 years old. Grandpa had been sending money to George's family since 2008. The son had graduated college last year. Grandpa knew this because he had quietly paid for half of it. You don't announce this kind of help. The moment you announce it, it stops being about them and starts being about you. I folded the letter very carefully and held it in both hands for a moment before putting it back in the envelope. Werner refilled my coffee without being asked. "What happens if I choose to dissolve the trust?" I asked. "It is within your legal authority," he said. "There would be tax implications, and the dissolution would need to be filed in both Swiss and U.S. jurisdictions. The process would take several months." I thought about Marcus, about his text, about the way he had stood in Grandpa's living room and picked up that card box and turned it over. And the family provision, I said. How was that structured? Werner explained it clearly. The provision was not a gift, it was a mechanism. Any designated family member could apply, documentation required, demonstrating specific financial hardship. The trustee, meaning me, could then approve disbursements tied to a structured plan. Debt repayment with third-party oversight. Defined timelines, no lump sums. Grandpa had built a door, not a window. You had to walk through it properly or not at all. I flew home the following morning. The flight was 9 hours and I slept for 4 of them and spent the other 5 thinking about what I was going to say. Marcus's car was in Grandpa's driveway when I arrived. I didn't know how he'd gotten in. He had a key. I hadn't thought to ask for it back. He was at the kitchen table with a legal pad, which he covered with his forearm when I walked in, like a student hiding answers on a test. I found an estate attorney, he said. In Richmond, she handles these kinds of things. I set my bag down and took off my coat. What kinds of things? Contested estates, cases where assets weren't properly disclosed. The trust was referenced in the will, I said. It was properly documented. The contents weren't itemized. They don't have to be. That's standard for this kind of instrument. He looked at me across the table. Something in his expression shifted. Not anger, not yet. Something more like recalibration. You knew, he said. You already knew about it before you went. I suspected. The ambassador told me where to go. What ambassador? The man at the burial. He served with Grandpa at the State Department. Marcus sat back. He rubbed his face with both hands and made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Of course, he said. Of course there was a man at the burial. He left $9 million, I said, in a trust, structured to support veterans and their families, and a scholarship fund at Virginia Tech. Marcus went still. $9 million, he said. Yes. He stood up slowly. He walked to the window and looked out at the backyard where Grandpa kept a small woodpile and a rusted bird feeder he never remembered to fill. And me, Marcus said. You're not named as a beneficiary. The silence after that was very long. He cut me out, he said finally. He built a structure, I said. There's a provision for family members in hardship. It's conditional, documented need, a repayment plan, third-party financial oversight. Marcus turned from the window. You want to put me on a budget. I want to protect what he built. That's his money. That's my mother's father's money. It was his money, I said. He decided what to do with it. He sat back down. He didn't say anything for a while. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, the hard edge replaced by something closer to exhaustion. He bailed me out twice, he said. I know that. I never forgot it. I know. But this is different. This is significant. Yes, he should have told me. I didn't agree with that, but I also didn't argue it. There are some conversations that only go in one direction, no matter what you say. He explained in his letter, I said, why he didn't tell anyone. Marcus looked at me. Money changes how people listen, I said. He was quiet. He wrote that, I said, specifically. He didn't want things to be different between us on Sundays. Something crossed Marcus's face that I hadn't seen there in a long time. Not anger, something older. He looked for a moment like the person he probably was before his business had failed and his father had died young and things had stopped going the way he'd planned. He liked you better, he said. It came out flat. He trusted me, I said. He loved you. Marcus stood up and picked up his jacket from the chair. He didn't say anything else before he left. He didn't slam the door. He closed it carefully, which somehow felt heavier. 3 weeks later, I received a formal notice from an attorney in Richmond. Marcus was filing a petition in circuit court, challenging the validity of the trust on the grounds of inadequate disclosure in the estate and potential undue influence. I was not surprised. I had half expected it from the moment he covered that legal pad when I walked in. I found my own attorney in Fredericksburg. Her name was Sylvia Crane. Retired military herself, Army JAG. 20 years. She had short hair and a very direct manner, and she reviewed everything in a single sitting. "This is airtight," she said. "He was thorough," I said. "He was thorough," she agreed. "The trust predates any relevant claim by 2 decades. There's no window for undue influence. The will references the trust by name and location. Your uncle is going to spend a lot of money on this, and it won't move." She was right about the money. The hearings were not dramatic. A plain courtroom in Spotsylvania County, beige walls, fluorescent lights, Sylvia and Marcus's attorney going back and forth over documents that my grandfather had spent years making unassailable. The judge was deliberate and unimpressed by the emotional framing Marcus's side kept returning to. The ambassador appeared at the 3rd hearing. He had not told me he was coming. He simply arrived, sat behind us, and when Sylvia called him to testify, he stood and walked to the witness box with the same unhurried composure he'd had at the graveside. He had known Harold Weston since 1998. He described my grandfather's character in specific terms, not praise exactly, documentation. He said Grandpa was a man who made decisions over long periods of time and did not reverse them. He said he had been aware of the trust's existence since the early years because Grandpa had asked for his informal guidance on one of the veteran beneficiaries. He said no one had influenced Harold Weston in any direction on any financial matter. If anything, he said, it was the other way around. Marcus's attorney tried to suggest the ambassador's presence at the burial had been manipulative. The ambassador responded without changing his tone at all. "I came to pay my respects," he said. "I told her where to go because Harold had asked me to deliver that message if he didn't get the chance himself." The judge dismissed the petition at the close of the 3rd hearing. She did not editorialize. She reviewed the findings and ruled and moved to the next case. Outside in the parking lot, Marcus found me before I reached my car. He looked like a person at the end of a long illness, not broken but drained. "You weren't going to move," he said. "No." He nodded slowly. "I didn't think you would." He said it without accusation, like a fact he had known for a while. We stood there in the cold parking lot, not saying anything for a long moment. "He didn't think I could handle it," Marcus said. "That's what it comes down to." "I don't think that's what it was," I said. "Then what?" I thought about the letter, about the men Grandpa had written about Clifton and George and the son who graduated college last year. "I think he was building something," I said, "and he needed it to last longer than any one person, including me." Marcus looked past me at the courthouse steps. "I have debt," he said. "Real debt. Not like a few credit cards. I have payroll debt from when the business almost went under last spring. It's significant." "I know," I said. "I looked at the provision again last night. It exists for exactly this." He looked at me carefully. "Conditions," he said. "Yes. Documentation. A financial counselor. Structured disbursements tied to a plan. Not a check, a process." He was quiet for a while. A car pulled out of the lot nearby. "He built that in on purpose," Marcus said. "Yes. He always thought I needed a structure. Most people do," I said. He exhaled slowly through his nose. "It wasn't agreement. Not exactly. But it wasn't refusal either." I drove to Charlotte 6 weeks later. Marcus's townhouse had the same slightly too full energy I remembered from previous visits, boxes in corners, projects started and not finished. He opened the door and stepped back to let me in without making a production of it. We sat at his kitchen table. I brought the documentation, what the provision covered, what the conditions were, the name of a financial counselor I had already contacted who had experience with small business debt. I walked him through it the way Werner had walked me through it, not handing it over. Walking through it together. Marcus asked questions. specific ones, which I took as a good sign. He pushed back on a couple of the oversight terms. I explained the reasoning. He listened. At one point he said, "This feels like he's still in the room." "Yeah," I said. "It does." He agreed to the conditions at the end of that conversation. Not enthusiastically, but he signed the intake paperwork and made the first appointment with the counselor and texted me afterward to say it had gone fine. That was enough for now. The trust continued exactly as Grandpa had structured it. The veteran disbursements went out on their schedule. One man in Oregon received funding for a second surgery that his VA coverage had denied. A woman in Georgia kept her house. 3 students who were children or grandchildren of Ranger Battalion veterans started receiving scholarship support. None of them knew Harold Weston's name. He had structured it that way. I drove back to Fredericksburg every few weeks. Grandpa's house was under contract by then. A young couple, first home. They had walked through it twice and made an offer that was fair. I sat in the empty living room the night before closing and thought about all the Sundays. The baseball games. The crossword puzzles. The coffee he made so strong it could hold a spoon upright. He had never once told me I was his favorite, or that he was proud, or that he trusted me more than anyone else. He had just kept making room for me to show up. And I had kept showing up. And somehow that had been the whole thing. In his letter he had written, "You come when it's ordinary. That's when it matters most. Anyone shows up for the big moments. You showed up for the boring ones." I think about that more than any other part of the letter. A year after the burial, Marcus and I drove to Fredericksburg together. Not because anyone arranged it. He called one evening in early March and asked if I was going to visit the grave around the anniversary, and I said yes. And he said he thought he might come too. We stood at the stone in the early morning. The grass was just starting to turn green at the edges. The stone was clean and simple, just his name and his dates and his branch of service. No extra inscription. He would have found that embarrassing. Marcus had changed in ways that were hard to describe exactly. He was less restless, maybe. He laughed more easily. He had paid down a substantial portion of his business debt, and he talked about his daughter's college plans with something that sounded like actual calm instead of performance. "I used to think he was withholding," Marcus said, looking at the stone. "I know. He wasn't, was he?" "No," I said. "He was directing." Marcus nodded. He put his hands in his coat pockets. "You really went to Zurich," he said. "I really went to Zurich." He shook his head. "He really built all that." "He did." We didn't say anything for a while. The morning was quiet. A groundskeeper moved somewhere in the distance. "I was wrong to sue you," Marcus said. "You were scared." I said both. We drove back separately. I stopped at a diner outside town and had coffee that was not as strong as Grandpa's and sat with my own thoughts for a while. I thought about what Werner had said that first day in the conference room when I'd asked him what my grandfather had said about me. That you were steady. I hadn't known that was a thing you could be. At 29, standing in someone's office in another country, holding documents that changed the shape of everything. I hadn't known it was something that could be passed between people across decades of Sunday visits and unremarkable conversations, and 2 extra bags of groceries every other week. But that's what it was. Grandpa had lived without announcements. He had built something large in complete silence and trusted it to the person he believed would carry it the same way. Not loudly, not for recognition, steady. Some weeks the work of the trust is administrative and small, reviewing disbursement requests, coordinating with Werner's office, reading the annual report from Virginia Tech on how the scholarship fund is performing. Other weeks, something unexpected comes through. A letter from a veteran's widow in South Carolina. A request I hadn't anticipated, a situation that requires judgment and care. Those weeks remind me that this is not a role. It's a responsibility, and responsibility I've come to understand is not a feeling. It's a practice. You do it again tomorrow the same way you did it today, without waiting to feel ready, because the point is that you keep showing up. Grandpa knew that. He lived it for 30 years without telling a single person. He just kept showing up for the boring ones. If someone in your life built something quietly, something you didn't understand until it was too late to thank them for it, I hope you're taking the time to recognize it now. And if you're the person building quietly, I hope you know it's enough. It's more than enough. Stay with us here at Noble Bearing. Leave a thought below about someone who showed up for the ordinary moments in your life. Because sometimes the greatest legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you make possible in the people who stay. I've thought a lot about why Grandpa didn't tell me. Not just about the trust, but about any of it. The passport stamps, the trips to Zurich, the years of quiet transfers that added up to $9 million sitting in a Swiss account while he drove a 2009 pickup and clipped coupons at the Kroger on Route 1. For a long time, I thought the answer was that he didn't trust people enough to tell them. But I've come to understand it differently. He trusted people exactly as much as they had shown him they deserved. And the way you show someone that is not through a conversation, it's through years of small, unremarkable choices that either add up to something or they don't. Marcus made his choices too. Not bad ones necessarily, just different ones. He chased growth and took risks and needed rescue twice, and both times Grandpa gave it without comment. That was real love, the kind that doesn't keep score out loud. But love and trust are not the same currency, and Grandpa knew that long before any of us had to learn it the hard way. What I keep returning to is the cause and effect of it all, not in a punishing way, just in a clear-eyed way. Marcus spent years treating his relationship with Grandpa like a transaction he was owed a return on, and so, when the return came, all he could see was the number. 9 million. What's mine? What's fair? I don't say this to condemn him. I understand it. I felt the pull of that kind of thinking myself. That moment in Werner's office when I looked at the number and felt something shift in my chest, before I even opened the letter. But then I read what Grandpa wrote. About Clifton. About George's son graduating college. About doing help quietly, so it stays about them and not about you. And I thought about what kind of person it takes to build something like that, and never once mention it, not even when you're lonely, not even when it might have made someone look at you differently. That's not luck. That's discipline applied over decades. That's a person who decided early what their life was going to be about and then just kept showing up to that decision every single day without needing anyone to notice. Grandpa's integrity wasn't an event. It was a practice, and it produced results. Real, measurable results. Not because the universe rewarded virtue in some cosmic sense, but because a person who lives with that kind of consistency builds things that last. Relationships that hold, structures that survive a court challenge, a granddaughter who drives 3 hours on a Sunday because she genuinely wants to. The wisdom in what he built wasn't financial, it was architectural. He understood that you don't change people by lecturing them. You change them by building something so solid and so clearly right that eventually they have no argument left. Marcus didn't soften because I won in court. He softened because he had nowhere left to put his anger once the structure held. Grandpa taught me that resilience isn't about withstanding the hard moment. It's about the 100 ordinary moments before it that make you who you are when the hard one arrives. You don't become steady in a crisis. You become steady on a Tuesday in February, when nothing is required of you and you show up anyway. I'm still learning that. Some weeks I feel the weight of the trust, and I wonder whether I'm the right person for it. And then I remember what Werner told me the first morning in that quiet office in Zurich, that Grandpa had described me with a single word: steady. And I think the reason he chose that word is because steadiness isn't a gift. It's a choice. One you make again every morning, the same way he did.